Hey everybody, I'm Todd Beardsley from Run Zero. I'm the Vice President of Security Research around here, and today I'm going to be talking to you about vulnerability haruspicy, pulling signals from the guts of vulnerability scoring systems. Don't worry, it's a little gross. In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about what haruspicy actually is. I'm going to be talking about three different vulnerability scoring systems: CVSS, EPSS, and SSVC. Don't worry, I'll expand all those acronyms out loud, but you can read them here on the screen. And I think we'll just jump right in. Haruspicy is an ancient practice practiced by, as you might expect, ancient people for divining the will of the gods through oracular means. In this case, it was usually through the use of animal sacrifice, pulling their livers out and seeing what's what. You would basically ask a yes or no question like, is tomorrow's military campaign going to be favorable for our side? Or will the crops do well this year? Things like that, right? And then you would bring your animal, it would get sacrificed by the haruspics, and they would have on hand a reference of thousands of favorable and unfavorable omens that you could spot in the liver. Livers are weird organs. Everyone looks different. You have little fat lines and lobes and different shapes, and all of this adds up, right, to an answer for the question of yes or no, will this thing happen? And so, if you have any stats background, you may notice that this is almost certainly an instance of p hacking, taking signals that are actually random and sorting them in such a way that they seem non-random. It also reminds me quite a bit of how we do vulnerability scoring system in cybersecurity today. The first and most important scoring system we have to talk about is CVSS. That is the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. It is made up of 8 vectors, and you don't actually need CVE itself, which is Common Vulnerability Enumeration Program. You don't need CVE to use CVSS, but many CVE identified vulnerabilities have CVSS scores attached to them. Um, the most common version out there is CVSS 3.1. Version 4 does exist, has for a while now, maybe a year or so. And CVSS 4 dials in more on scope. So, like when you attack something, is it just that thing or are other things affected? It does this by asking two or three other more questions. It's not very popular right now. CVSS 3.1 is the one that pretty much everyone has standardized on. There are some CVSS 4 scores out there, but for this, we're going to be talking mainly about 3.1. The biggest upside for CVSS is great for checkbox security. So you may have a mandate from your boss or a regulation that says, "Hey, you have to mitigate CVEs." Which is a small set of vulnerabilities that hit CVSS 7.0 or higher. CVSS goes from 0 to 10, and that may be your mandate. Which is great for checking a box. Does it do anything good for security? We'll see. It's also really good for writing breathless tech news headlines. So anything that hits CVSS 9.8 or 10.0, and if it's implicated in an attack at all, like that's what leads, right? It's like, oh, this is a hugely important vulnerability. So let's go through what a CVSS score is actually made up of. First off, we have the version. In this case, it's 3.1. We have the access vector. This is one of 4 possibles. In this case, we have access vector of network. It can be network adjacent, which is like an adjacent network, not actually like the whole internet, typically. Then we have local, which means like you can only do it locally. Like this is usually things like file format bugs. I email you a poisoned Microsoft Word doc and you have to click it, right? That would be a access vector local. Or physical. I have to be hands on keyboard. I have to be touching the thing in order to exploit this vulnerability. Then we have attack complexity. It's either low or high. This is mostly about things that are not in the attacker's control. So, like, there is some kind of precondition to exploiting this vulnerability. Sometimes this is expressed as like a non-default configuration, or you have to wait for a certain circumstance to arise that you can't cause yourself, right? So race conditions often get thrown in here, but many vulnerabilities are exploited by I can jigger the results of a race condition. I can always win or I can always lose the race, right? And so that's where attack complexity comes into play. It's a little bit more subjective. Um, the privileges required vector is either none, which means anyone, you don't need a username or a password, you don't need to authenticate at all. Low, which is some user can do it, or high, which is almost always root or application admin, something like that. You can make an argument that a vulnerability that requires you to be root to exploit it is not actually a vulnerability at all. Some people do. Sometimes they become CVE identified vulnerabilities. It depends on the vulnerability. We'll find throughout this presentation that it depends on the vulnerability is often a fallback. Next up, we have user interaction. This often coupled with something like an access vector local means that either yes or no, the user need the victim, right, needs to do something. They have to like click on a link, or they have to visit a particular website, or they have to do something. I can't just like fire it at you. Almost always, a client-side vulnerability is going to be require user interaction. And server-side vulnerabilities like I attack your SSH server does not. And then we get into scope. Scope is probably the weirdest vector in CVSS. Scope in CVSS 3.1 is either changed or unchanged. Changed is worse, and changed means when I attack this system, I have an effect on that system. It is probably one of the least understood of the vectors. People get this wrong all the time, but you take a look at some CVEs, at your favorite CVEs, and see if the scope has changed or not. It's really funny too because like the entire math of CVSS, like how you get that final number, all hinges on scope changed or unchanged, which is like pretty far, as you can see, pretty far down the stack. So it's funny math. And then we get into impact, right? We have the impact triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And so confidentiality can be none, low, or high. Same for integrity, same for availability. Availability is a funny one. I get into arguments about this because I'm a nerd and I care about CVSS for some reason. Availability is usually reserved for things like I can send you a malformed packet and your thing crashes. So like that's all I get. I don't get remote code execution. I can't read passwords. I can't do anything cool like that. All I can do is crash you. And that is what this is for. A lot of times you'll see vulnerabilities described in CVSS as having like confidentiality high, integrity high, and availability high, which implies that availability is really a function of integrity and not its own thing, which kind of muddies some scores, especially on the high end. It's very difficult to have a CVSS 10.0, a perfect 10 CVSS without availability also being high, all three of them being high. But it doesn't really make a lot of sense because like if your integrity if it's rated integrity high, that usually means I have like total control over the system as an attacker. I can do whatever I want. So one of the things I could do is like RMRF the file system, which would make the system unavailable then forever. But that's not really a function of the vulnerability. That's more of a payload of the exploit, which is a small distinction. It's a well actually style distinction, really, when it comes down to it. So hopefully you've seen through this that CVSS scoring, while it intends to be objective, and these vectors are pretty good, there is room for subjectivity in here, and we will tend to see that researchers who find bugs in other people's stuff tend to juice these a little bit higher. They may say, like I say, they may say the availability is higher than it really is, or they may overestimate the initial access vector, right? Like just because it talks TCP/IP, does that mean that it's always on the internet? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe the attack complexity seems low for me, but high for you. There are many subtleties in each of these vectors. So researchers tend to push these up a little bit. Vendors who don't want people talking about their vulnerabilities tend to push these down a little. There is ways to get to the truth, but it's long and complicated, and we have many thousands of vulnerabilities. The thing that sticks out the most about CVSS is the distribution of these scores. These scores seem like numbers. They look like numbers. They even sound like numbers. Um, but this is a sample distribution of a random 76-day period where we see this kind of roller coaster curve, right? It starts off on a little bit of an incline from 1 to 2, and then kind of goes and then goes up and up and up and up, and then a big drop around 8, and then a little bump at the end for 9 or 10, right? Like that is a typical, oddly, a typical distribution of CVSS scores for a given time period. How given are we talking about here, right? Well, this is a 1 year view right here. And you'll see the curve is very similar, right? Like, so a 70-day view looks very, very similar to a 1 year view. And this is a 5 year view. So there's not a ton of difference. We see a little in the 5 year view, we see a little bit more of a slope on the very end, getting into that nines and tens. But you can see through all three of these, the shapes are very similar. So that is suspicious. If like remember, these are all vulnerabilities issued during these time periods, and so it's tons of different software written by different people, different companies with different coding styles, different frameworks. They're all discovered by different kinds of people who are finding them, right? And there is the fact that this distribution is not just random, right? Like we don't randomly see like a low, a medium, a high, because that would just like the chart would be all over the place, right? If it was truly random. And it would be evenly distributed among all of them over time, you would hope that, the severity of vulnerabilities goes down as we get better at writing better software. But that does not seem to be the case. Like if you were just to take CVSS scores, just the score themselves, you would come, if you were me, you would come to the conclusion that we're not getting any better at writing secure software. We're finding bugs at about the same rate. We're finding the same kinds of bugs at about the same rate, which is depressing, but don't worry. The real answer is CVSS is really good at just reflecting its own math over and over and over again. Any time scale, the distribution is consistent with that like kind of roller coaster curve. There is a very suspicious lack of medium severity, like low to medium severities in that like 2 to 4 kind of range, which tells me there's a couple of ways to explain for that, right? Like maybe it's not worth it to disclose that like low to medium range of vulnerabilities. You just fix it and you move on. Or I find one in some software, it's kind of a pain to write it up and kind of a pain to get through like the whole CVE process, so I'm not going to bother. Maybe I'll tell the vendor, maybe I won't, maybe I'll just sit on it. This is super dangerous because we've seen over and over again, specifically from folks like Watchtower, it is possible to chain vulnerabilities together. So you might have 2 or 3 mediums that all hit different parts of that CVSS vector string. You chain them all together, you have unauthenticated remote code execution. Individually, maybe not worth reporting. Altogether, definitely worth reporting. The patterns, like I say, they are persisting through today. I look periodically to see if anything is changing, and they don't seem to be changing, at least by curve wise. So that tells us that we're maybe not making any progress here in CVE land. And these are all among CVE identified vulnerabilities, by the way. Um, but really, when it comes down to it, I would say that the vectors for CVSS are actually useful. Like these eight things describe vulnerabilities are the eight things that like I talk about all the time. And so one good one good tip is like maybe don't rely too hard on the score because the score is always going to be 7.2 or 7.8. Like those are the top two scores. But getting there is like with everything, getting there is the fun. So there's some more things happening kind of today in CVSS. This is the PDSS, which is some future work that is happening kind of right now. This is the pipeline vulnerability scoring system. There's also the AI VSS, which got a little press. It has backing from OWASP. That tries to talk about like how dangerous is your how dangerous is your agentic AI system and how racist is it? I'm not super sure where they're going to go with that. They seem to be building on CVSS because it's tried and true. But as we see, CVSS has its own a little bit of a subjectivity problem, and more so like the scores just seem to bang out the same every time. So, moving on, we have EPSS, which is the Exploit Prediction Scoring System, and it has prediction right in the name. It's great. It was released in 2021. It's backed by FIRST, which is International Incident Responders Organization. I like it. It's pretty fun. It's also kind of a cult. So it's easiest to think of EPSS as having a right side and a left side. And then on one side, you have all of the attributes of a vulnerability, right? You've got those CVSS vectors, cares a lot about those. Um, Keywords in the descriptions. Is it on a known exploited vulnerability list or not? Is there hacker chatter about this on Mastodon or LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever, right? How many references are there and what are the quality of those references and other attributes about the vulnerability as they enter CVE? Important note, EPSS is very much tied to CVE. You don't get to use EPSS and not CVE. CVE is the corpus. Presumably, you could invent its EPSS that doesn't use CVE, but there's no implementation that does that. On the other side, you have a collection of network activity. And so you've got things like honeypot hits, you've got IDS logs, you've got IPS logs, you've got EDR logs, endpoint detection and response events, right? And you've got a whole bunch of cybersecurity vendor threat feeds and just like network activity that's out there. And that feeds into EPSS as well to see like, oh, is this vulnerability being exploited, right? And vulnerabilities, and so what EPSS does is it takes all this traffic, it takes all these attributes of these vulnerabilities. It knows like what vulnerabilities have what attributes, and then it'll start guessing of saying like, well, this thing is getting exploited right now. So here are all the vulnerabilities that are like that vulnerability, and so they're more likely to be exploited in the future. That's the value proposition of EPSS. It is because it's machine learning. It is very agnostic on very specific vulnerability qualities. It sometimes picks out its own thing because AI. Maybe vulnerabilities that start with S, are is one of the attributes. Can't know, right? Without looking. Um, what this does is it produces a probability of that particular vulnerability getting exploited in the next 30 days of each particular vulnerability, rather. It's not a rating. It doesn't say low, medium, or high. It doesn't say anything about effect or anything like that. It is purely probability based. But what is exploitation activity? Um, so if you go through EPSS and you total them all up, all the probabilities from 0.0001 to 99 point, I think 97 is the highest it goes. It never hits 100. If you total all those up and then you run a bunch of simulations and figure like, okay, well, how many of all the 250,000 CVEs are there should be exploited all the time? It comes up with about 10,000 or so of these unique CVEs that should be exploited every month. In my opinion, this is an incredibly high number. Like when we have like a bad month, generally in cybersecurity, it means a bad month would be like 4 or 5 that we get all spun up about. And that means like a breach happened or like a major outage happened or something like that, right? The CISA known exploited vulnerabilities list has a grand total of about 1,400 actively exploited vulnerabilities covering several years. So why the disconnect, right? And the disconnect is because exploitation activity does not mean breach. It does not mean, hacker voice, I'm in when that thing pops. All it means is that there are indicators that that vulnerability is being scanned for, is being maybe probed. Maybe it's a false positive. It could be like a vulnerability that looks like a whole lot of other vulnerabilities, but are impossible to distinguish on the wire, right? And so you have these very broad definitions of what exploitation actually means. And it doesn't mean the thing you think it means. And so that's where you get this like 10,000 or so number. Um, and more importantly, it's limited, right, by the things it can see. So big, noisy, obvious exploitation is going to drive EPSS scores on the right side. But also things like getting added to the kev will bump an EPS score. Getting added to a nuclei template, getting added to a Metasploit module. These are things that are very big and obvious, and so these are going to juice scores quite a bit. And speaking of juicing scores, we can see this happen over time, right? This is an example, volatile CVE. This is CVE 2023, 40477. This was released around, I won't get into it, but you can take it as an article of faith that this is released in 2023 based on the name, but that's not actually accurate. Um, and for the longest time, it was hanging down in your, sub 20% zone. Every once in a while, it would blip up a little bit. And then all of a sudden in May of this year, it jumped to 93.6%. Why is that? EPSS has no opinion on the matter. And so that is the puzzle for you, dear researcher, to figure out why these are happening. At Run Zero, we released a little web app called EPSS Pulse. If you just Google for it, you'll find it. But it's like runzero.com/EPSS-Pulse. And we run a daily tracker every day now of which scores jumped up or down in a significant way over one day. And those are the things maybe you want to look at because oftentimes it means like, oh, there's a new Metasploit module for that thing. I better go check it out, right? EPSS is not just a Metasploit module detector. There's a lot of things that make these scores go up and down. Sometimes it remains mysterious, but a lot of times you can figure it out. And so if you want to play along, EPSS Pulse is the way to do it. So, it's like I say, it's a little bit occult. It's sometimes difficult to say why a score changes. I especially am mystified as to why scores go down. Like maybe I have no idea, right? I have no idea. I keep trying to figure it out. But I think that the changes in the probabilities are the more interesting thing, right? Um, if you look at a given time scale in any given month, the figures here are from March to April, but I've been looking month to month. Um, you'll see 60 to 100 or so that move dramatically in one day by like 40 or 50 points. That is interesting to me, especially because it's now cut my corpus of 250,000 down to like under 100, right? So that's suddenly feels useful. It's at least something I can say like, oh, I'm looking at these because they've moved recently on EPSS, and sometimes I find stuff, right? Sometimes I'll find like, oh, there was a breach. Look at that. And EPSS is like a nice signpost for that. Many are on Kev, most are not. And I don't know what a good threshold is yet of like what should trigger investigation. So if you want to find out, again, please play along at home. And then finally, we're going to get into SSVC. SSVC is the Stakeholder-Specific Vulnerability Categorization System. It is a basically it's a decision tree. It's a formalized decision tree. It was written down by CISA, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, in partnership with Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon University, which is a lot of words. But basically, they put together this kind of neat system that I like a lot. It's and what it does is it gets you from like, oh, how bad is this vulnerability to what should we do about it? It is extremely dependent on you being aware of your environment. It is not really a scoring system, just like all of these are not really scoring systems. Um, but it's more of a decision tree. And the decision tree is a way to get to a decision point, right? And in SSVC, there are four decision points. There's track, monitor, attend, and act. It's up to you to decide what those actually mean, right? Typically, what this means is that, like, if you get, well, we'll go through the scoring system, we'll talk about it. Um, and it is better as a starting point for having conversations with your management of like, when something is bad, what should I do? It is the vaguest way mappable to severity. High severity things tend to mean more pressing action, but it's not strictly for that. And so this is the eye chart. These are all the possible decisions, and we'll go through them here, just kind of chunk by chunk, right? And so SSVC asks, is there already exploitation of this? Yes or no, right? So imagine all of EPSS boiled down into one question. Is there exploitation or is there a known proof of concept exploitation in public that anyone can run? If so, move on, right? Is the exploit automatable or does it need user interaction? Is the technical impact of this exploitation bad? It's either you only have two choices in this one. It is the technical impact is either partial or total. If it's none, it's not a vulnerability. So you can throw that right away. But if the technical impact is bad, then you move on and you say, how important are the targets? This is something only you can answer, right? Like if there's a giant Windows bug out there, a bug in SMB v1, let's just say, that affects old Windows machines that don't have SMB v1 turned off, and you know for sure that you are an Apple and Google Cloud shop, right? You have no SMB anywhere. For you, this would be no big deal. For the world, a big deal, right? But for you, you have very little to do. And then finally, are people gonna die if someone exploits this vulnerability? Is there like is the mission in danger? Are people going to be injured? Is massive amounts of property going to be destroyed? This typically like just like basically boils down all of industrial control systems into one question. And then at the end, you will find you either have to track this vulnerability, which is the lowest score, which means like, okay, well, I know about it. If something changes, I'll go reassess. Or I'll monitor. I'll do that, but harder. Attend and act tend to be the things where like who gets woken up over this? Like when does this hit a report that your boss sees, and when does this hit a report that your boss's boss sees? That tends to be the difference between attend and act. There may be other things, right? Like if you're responsible for seeing that patches are deployed and you know that there's a patch for this thing, then maybe act is stop the presses, apply all the patches, reboot, right? Like emergency out of band change, right? Whereas an attend might mean like, oh, I need to do this the next time that there's a change window. So ultimately, it's Tarot. It's a series of very short questions, but the good news is that CISA, as an authorized data publisher, is doing a lot of the work for you right now. For CVEs, for many CVEs, it will go through the vulnrichment process. And what vulnrichment does, importantly for SSVC, is tell you specifically, is there a known exploit for this thing out there, or was it exploited? Is it currently on the Kev? I mean, in addition, it will also give a guess as to whether or not the technical impact is low or high, right? So with those two things, all you need to do now is like be aware of your environment, which is easier said than done. It's kind of the reason why Run Zero exists is to help people, get a hold of their environment. Um, but 2 out of 3 is not bad, and it gets you kind of in the game really fast. So if you were to take everything that hit these two basic qualities, the worst possible of technical impact and exploitation, that gets you to about 400. It's edging into 500 right now. Recent vulnerabilities to review. Not as great as like the 60-ish or so that we saw from EPSS. It's a wider scope, right? But it is a fairly much smaller than your annual output of CVE IDs. And again, like I say, like it is on you to assess your environment. So that is the thing that makes SSVC hard. It also is the thing that makes SSVC less useful than CVSS. With CVSS, I can talk about vulnerabilities irrespective of my environment with other people. In SSVC, I can't. I have to, I am very much limited to my specific environment. That's why it's stakeholder specific. In the end, the real vulnerability scoring system, of course, are the friends we made along the way. And I mean that literally. You will, in your career, run into people who are really good at this and who have lived through a lot of past breaches and have seen vulnerabilities pop off that were somewhat unexpected. And so while these mechanistic scoring systems are useful in the sense that they often highlight something about a vulnerability and give you like a language and a context for it. The end result of, a number or a percentage or an action like may not be particularly useful in describing that vulnerability. Whereas there's this squishy human thing that humans are pretty good at spotting, right? Um, so like LLMs and machine learning, it can all be useful, but it is required to use these tools with the assistance of a human expert who can make a call on these kinds of things, right? And then in the end, none of these scoring systems or prediction systems or probability generators can tell you about human motivation, right? Maybe there is some like low SEV vulnerability out there that someone really just wants to exploit. And there's nothing we have today that can tell you why that is. This is especially true, not just philosophically, but practically, when you have cases where vulnerabilities can be chained together, right? And so, like I said before, individually, they may not seem like much. Taken together, it may be super powerful, right? And like, as far as I know, I don't know of any exploit chain building system. Hey, maybe that's something for your next startup. Go for it. Um, of like, and you could call it like, I don't know, chain predict. You can use that. Have fun. But known exploited vulnerability lists are useful to know, are useful in that they tell you what are bad guys doing, right? They solve that human motivation problem by saying like, well, they definitely exploited this one. Now, it may be too late if you're not the victim in the Kev, good job, I guess. You outran that bear. But you want to, jump on those right away. Also trust groups, just monitoring for weird behavior, monitoring your environment for weird assets, go a long, long way toward helping figure out like what your particular exposure is. And then, having someone around who has seen it before tends to be really, really helpful. So all of this is in a paper called Divining Risks, Deciphering Signals from Vulnerability Scores. You can go get it at the QR code on the left side of the screen. Um, if you want to hear more yammering about this, we recorded a Run Zero Hour webcast back in May where we talked with Jay Jacobs, who is the motive force behind EPSS. And we talk about vulnerability scoring systems and get super nerdy and a little bit spicy. And then if you have ideas on, well, namely why EPSS jumps around so much, but anything else about vulnerability scoring system, hit me up. I love talking about this stuff, and I'm on Mastodon. And that's it for me today. I hope you had a great time, and I'm going to stop recording right now. Later on.